Silver on the Tree by Susan Cooper, Part 4, The Midsummer Tree, Chapter 17, The Train. Simon and Jane had left the dunes and crossed the golf course, coming to the wire fence edging the railway track, when they heard a strange noise. It rang out over their heads on the wind, a clear, startling metallic clang like the single blow of a hammer on an anvil. "What was that?" Jane was very jumpy still. "Railway signal, look." Simon pointed to the lonely pole standing beside the track ahead. "I never noticed it was there before. Must be a train coming." Simon said slowly, "But the signal's gone to stop." "Well, the train's already been by then," Jane said without interest. "Oh, Simon, I wish we knew what's happening to Bonnie." She broke off, listening as a long, shrieking, husky whistle came on the wind from a long way off toward Taiwan. They were standing close to the railway fence now. The whistle came again, louder. There was a humming in the rails. "There's the train coming now." "But such a funny noise." And they saw, in the distance, against the growing gray clouds, a long plume of white smoke, and heard the rising roar closer and closer of a fast-moving train. Then it came into sight, round the distant bend, and grew clearer, rushing at them. And it was like no train they'd ever seen before. Simon gave a great whoop of astonished joy. "Steam!" Almost at once there was a sudden hissing and groaning and scraping as the train came closer to the signal, and the driver flung on his brakes. Black smoke belched from the funnel of the enormous green locomotive harnessed to the long train, longer than any normally on that line. A dozen carriages or more, all gleaming as if new in two colors, chocolate brown below and creamy almost white above. The train slowed its wheels, screeching and whimpering on the track. The vast engine came slowly past Simon and Jane, standing wide-eyed at the fence, and the driver and fireman, blue-overalled, dusty-faced, grinned and raised hands in greeting. With a last long whish of steam, the train stopped and stood still, hissing gently. And in the first carriage, a door swung open, and a tall figure stood in the doorway with one hand outstretched, beckoning. "Come on now, open the fence, quickly." "Great Uncle Mary!" They clambered over the wire fence, and Merriman hauled them one by one up into the train. From the level of the ground, the door was almost as high as their heads. Merriman swung the door shut with a solid crash. They heard the clang of the signal once again as its arm went down, and then the locomotive began to stir, a slow, heavy chuffing rising in speed and sound, with the dunes slipping past outside, faster and faster, swaying, rocking, clickety-clacking, the wheels beginning to sing. Jane choked suddenly and clutched at Merriman. "Bonnie! They've taken Bonnie, Gummery!" He held her close for a moment. "Quietly, gently now. Bonnie is where we are going." "Truly?" "Truly." Merriman led them to the first compartment in the swaying train, its long plush seats quite empty. He closed the sliding glass door behind him, and they collapsed on the padded cushions. "That engine, Gummery!" Simon, an expert railway fancier, was lost in admiring wonder. "King class from the old Great Western ages ago. And this old-fashioned carriage, I didn't think they even existed anymore outside a museum." "No?" Merriman said vaguely. Sitting there, he looked the same rumpled figure who had wandered occasionally into their lives for as long as they could remember. His long, bony frame wore a nondescript dark sweater and trousers, and his thick white hair was tousled. He was staring out of the window. The little compartment was suddenly dark, lit only by a dim yellow bulb in the ceiling, as the train dived into a succession of short tunnels and came out beyond. Aberdyfi. Running again along the river, a small station whisked by. "Is this some special train?" Simon said. "Not stopping at stations?" "Where are we going?" said Jane. "Not too far," Merriman said. "Not very far." Simon said abruptly, "Will and Bran have the sword." "I know," Merriman said. He smiled proudly. "I know. Now rest a little and wait. And do not show surprise at meeting anyone on this train, no matter who it may be." Before they could wonder what he might mean, a figure stopped in the corridor outside their compartment. The window door slid open, and John Rawlins stood there, swaying with the motion of the train. He looked spruce and unfamiliar in a dark and rather baggy suit. He was staring at them in amazement. "Good day, John Rawlins," Merriman said. "Well, fancy that now," John Rawlins said blankly. He smiled slowly at Jane and Simon and nodded, then he looked at Merriman, a strange look, wary and puzzled. "Funny places we do meet in," he said. Merriman gave an amiable shrug. "Where are you going, Mr. Rawlins?" Jane said. John Rawlins grimaced. "Shrewsbury, to the dentist. And for blood to do a bit of shopping." The train's whistle shrieked, and another small station flashed by. They were deep in the hills now, traveling through cuttings, with little to be seen outside the windows, but high, grassy banks blurred by speed. In the train corridor, somebody approached John Rawlins. He straightened, standing back. Simon said politely, "Hello, Mrs. Rawlins." Jane heard the warm Welsh voice. "Well, here is a nice surprise, then. I wondered who John was talking to, not having seen anyone we knew get on the train at Darwin." There was a faint question in the words, but Simon wrote over it. "Isn't it a marvellous train? Steam." "Just like in the old days," John Rawlins said. "Must be some sort of anniversary, revival, whatever. I thought I was back 30 years when she came into the station." "Won't you come and sit here with us, Mrs. Rawlins?" Jane said. "That would be very nice." Smiling, Bloodwind Rawlins moved into the doorway so that she could see Jane. Her eyes flickered past Merriman. "Oh," said Jane. "Mrs. Rawlins, this is our great-uncle, Professor Lyon." That's che," said Merriman, his deep voice expressionless. "How do you do?" said Bloodwind Rawlins, nodding, still smiling. She added to Jane, "I will just get my bag," and disappeared along the corridor. "I didn't know you spoke Welsh," Simon said. "On occasion," Merriman said. "Like a native," John Rawlins said. He came into the compartment and sat down next to Simon. Two figures passed in the corridor, then another, without looking in. "Is the train full?" Jane said, looking after the last retreating back. "Filling up," Merriman said. Mrs. Rawlins came back with her handbag and hesitated in the doorway. "Would you like the corner?" said Jane automatically, moving up the seat toward Merriman. "Thank you, my dear." Bloodwind Rawlins gave her the astonishing smile that made her face glow with warmth and sat down next to her. "And where are you all going?" she said. Jane looked into her eyes, so friendly and close, and paused. A great sense of strangeness swept over her. There seemed to be no light in Bloodwind Rawlins' eyes, as if they were not rounded but flat. She thought, "Don't be silly." Blinked, looked away, and said, "Great-Uncle Mary's taking us out for the day." "To the marches," Merriman said, in the deep, unemotional voice he used for strangers. "The border country, where all the battles so often began. Bloodwind Rawlins took some knitting from her bag, a bright red bundle, and said, "Very nice." The train swayed and sang. A large man passed slowly in the corridor, paused, looked in, and gave a courteous half-bow toward Merriman. They all stared at him. He had indeed a striking appearance. His skin was very black, and his hair snow-white. Merriman inclined his head gravely in return, and the man moved away. Jane became conscious of a rapid clicking sound. Mrs. Rawlins had started knitting very fast. Simon said in a fascinated hiss, "Who was that?" "An acquaintance of mine," Merriman said. Down the corridor in the same direction, limping, leaning on a stick, came an elderly lady in an elegant but old-fashioned coat, with a toque-like hat set at a dashing angle on her head, and a certain wild wispiness about her pinned-up gray hair. She nodded at Merriman. "Good day, Lyon," she said in a "Good day, Lyon," she said in a resonant, imperious voice. Merriman said gravely, "Good day, madam," and the lady's sharp eyes flickered over them all, and then she was gone. 4 small boys ran past, laughing, chattering boisterously. "What weird clothes," said Jane with interest, leaning to peer after them. "Sort of tunics." The train swayed and lurched, roaring round a bend, and she sat back again rather suddenly. Simon said thoughtfully, Some kind of uniform, maybe? Mrs. Rowlands took out a second ball of wool from her bag, yellow, and began knitting it together with the red. A busy train, John Rowlands said. If there were more like this, they might not be talking about closing the line. Simon stood up, steadying himself against the door jamb. Excuse me a moment. Certainly, Merriman said. He began an amiable conversation with John Rowlands about the necessity for railway service, while Mrs. Rowlands listened, rapidly knitting, and Jane watched the purple-brown sweep of the mountains and the close grassy banks alternatively flashing by. Simon disappeared for a long time and stuck his head in the door. Show you something, he said casually to Jane. She went out with him. He closed the door and drew her to the end of the corridor, where a locked door ended the coach. This is the front end of the train, Simon said in a peculiar voice. There's nothing this side of our compartment. So? Said Jane. So if you think about all those people who've been coming past, Jane gasped. It all came out in a sort of hiccup. They came from this end, all of them, but they couldn't have. But they did, Simon said, and I'll bet you there'll be more after we go back. The train's pretty full already as far as I went. The most peculiar mixture of people, in all different clothes, all kinds of colors and shapes. It's like the United Nations. They looked at one another. Jane said slowly, Better go back, I suppose. Look normal, Simon said. Concentrate. Jane was trying so hard to concentrate that she went past the door to their compartment to the next. A man sitting in the corner there facing her looked up as she approached and smiled through the window. A sudden, warm, broad smile of recognition. He was an oldish man with a round, weather-beaten face and wiry gray eyebrows, his hair fluffed out in a gray tonsure round a bald head. Captain Tom's, Jane said joyfully, and then she blinked, or the air seemed to blink, and there was no one there. What? Said Simon. I thought, Jane said. I thought I saw someone we used to know. She looked hard at the empty seat, but there was nobody in the compartment at all. But I didn't. Normal now, Simon said. He lifted the sliding door of their own compartment, and they went back in. They sat in silence, while voices eddied round them, and Mrs. Rowland's needles furiously clicked. Jane leaned her head back, looking out of the window, letting the rhythm of the wheels carry her mind. They clattered and clacked, merging with the needle's sound. With a twitch of nightmare, she felt they were chattering, into the dark, into the dark, into the dark. Then, all at once, Jane's mouth was dry and her fingers clutched at her seat. Like a mist, she could see in the fields outside a group of horsemen riding, galloping, leaping hedges, and through the train, and though the train was rushing at full speed, yet they were riding as fast as the train. In troops and streams they rode, some all in black and some in white. And as the massing gray clouds came rolling in from the west, the horsemen were galloping now through the clouds, through the sky, as if the clouds were great gray mountains and hills. Wide-eyed, Jane hardly dared move. She edged one hand along the seat toward Merriman, and before it reached him, his own strong hand was holding hers for a moment. Don't be afraid, Jane, he said in her ear. This is the rising, yes, the last pursuit, and the danger will grow now, but they will not touch this time train of ours, for we carry on it something of their own. The train, thundering, rocked furiously along the track. The compartment grew dim as the sky outside darkened with cloud and rushing fingers. The rhythm of Mrs. Rowland's busy needles faltered, and Jane saw the bright colors waver as her fingers slowed. The sound of the train began to change. The beat of the wheels fell off. The pitch of its fast song dropped. There was a sharp, muffled report under the wheels, somewhere a little way ahead, and then another, and the train began gradually to slow down, and we will pause there.